Clara McCade pressed the dead man's key into her palm so hard it drew blood. Behind her, the door to Hargrove's office swung open, and a voice she did not recognize said, "Ma'am, you need to hand that over. Right now." She turned slowly. Two men, badges on their chests that looked real until you noticed the sheriff's seal was stamped upside down. Her bag was still in her hand. Her trunk was still on the platform. She had been in Red Rock, New Mexico territory, for exactly 11 minutes. If this story speaks to something you have carried a long time, subscribe to this channel and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about what one woman can do with nothing but a key, a ledger, and the truth. The train had been 3 days late out of Cincinnati. Clara McCade had spent those 3 days in a seat that smelled of coal smoke and other people's dinners, her leather satchel balanced across her knees, her account ledger open to a page she had read so many times the numbers had stopped meaning anything. She was not nervous. She had told herself that so many times across 3 states that she almost believed it. She was practical. She was prepared. She had a signed letter of employment from the law office of Edward Hargrove, Red Rock, New Mexico territory, dated March 4th, 1882. She had references from 2 firms in Cincinnati, 1 in Columbus. She had her own pens, her own ink, her own set of account books with her initials stamped on the cover in gold foil that had already begun to peel. She had $7.30 in a money clip inside her boot, which her grandmother had told her was the only safe place for a woman traveling alone. What she did not have was any idea that Edward Hargrove had been dead for 6 days. The station at Red Rock was smaller than she expected. A single platform, a hand-painted sign, 3 men lounging against the wall of the depot, with the particular stillness of men who had nothing to do and all day to do it. Clara stepped down from the car, adjusted her satchel strap, and looked for the man whose photograph Hargrove had sent in his last letter. Round face, spectacles, a dark coat. Standing by the wagon he had promised would meet her. No wagon, no round face, no spectacles. She waited 20 minutes on the platform, watching the other passengers collect their people and their things and disappear into the noise of the town. The 3 men against the depot wall watched her back. She did not acknowledge them. Finally, she walked to the ticket window. "I'm looking for Edward Hargrove," she said. "He was meant to meet me." The man behind the window was young, maybe 20, with a neck that had not yet caught up with his collar. He looked at her, then looked past her at the 3 men against the wall, then looked back at her with an expression she had seen before, the expression of someone who knew something and was deciding how little of it to share. "Mr. Hargrove passed, ma'am," he said. "Week ago, maybe 6 days." Clara set her satchel down on the counter. "Passed meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning dead, ma'am. Fell from his horse out on the Cutter Road. Doc said it was the fall that did it." He paused. "Awful sorry." She stood very still. She did not say anything. Outside, a dog barked at something and then stopped. "Is there a hotel," she said, "or a boarding house in town?" "Mrs. Dempsey takes boarders, down past the feed store. Yellow door." "Thank you." She picked up her satchel and walked back out into the heat. The 3 men against the wall had not moved. The largest one, thick through the shoulders with a face like weathered saddle leather, pushed off the wall as she walked past. "You the woman Hargrove sent for?" She kept walking. "I don't see how that's your business." "It might be," he said, falling into step beside her in a way that was not quite threatening and was not quite anything else. "Hargrove's office is closed up. His things are in the custody of the bank while the estate gets sorted. If you got anything belonging to him, papers, letters, anything like that, the bank's the right place to bring it." Clara stopped walking. She turned to look at him. He was a head taller than her and probably twice her weight. And he was smiling in the particular way of men who had learned that smiling made things easier than not smiling. "I received a letter of employment," she said, "which is my property, not Mr. Hargrove's. If the bank has questions about the estate, I suggest they consult a lawyer." She paused, which Mr. Hargrove apparently was. "Good afternoon." She walked away. She felt his eyes on her back the whole length of the street. Ruth Dempsey was a woman of 60 with gray hair pulled straight back from a face that looked like it had survived a great deal and intended to survive considerably more. She answered the door of the yellow-doored boarding house, looked Clara up and down in a single efficient sweep, and said, "You'll want the back room. It's cooler, and nobody can see the window from the street. $1 a week, meals included. No men past the front hall." "That suits me," Clara said. "You're the one Hargrove sent for from Cincinnati." "I am." Ruth stepped back to let her in. "Come inside before someone sees you standing here. There are men in this town who make it their business to know other people's business. And you've been here 20 minutes and already caught their attention. I saw you on the platform." Clara followed her through a narrow hall that smelled of beeswax and dried herbs. "You knew Hargrove?" Everybody knew Ed Hargrove. He was the only lawyer in 40 miles who hadn't been bought. Ruth pushed open a door at the end of the hall. The room was plain and clean. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window with the curtain drawn. He didn't fall off his horse. Clara set her trunk down. She looked at Ruth. "Ed Hargrove had ridden that Cutter Road 1,000 times," Ruth said. "His horse knew every stone on it. And Ed didn't drink, didn't have a temper, was careful about everything. Too careful to fall." She folded her arms. "But that's what the official finding says, so that's what it is." "Who made the official finding?" "Sheriff Baines, who works for Jerome Aldgate, who owns the bank, who has been buying up land in this county for 2 years at prices nobody can explain and nobody asks about." Ruth's mouth was a straight line. Ed was asking about it. Loudly. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her satchel and took out Hargrove's last letter. She had read it enough times to have it memorized, but she unfolded it anyway and looked at the last paragraph. "I have enclosed a key. Keep it on your person and do not mention it to anyone until you arrive. There are documents in my office safe that I have not been able to share through the post. When you are here, I will explain everything. Come as soon as you are able. Time may be shorter than I would like." She folded the letter and put it back. The key was in her boot, next to the money clip. "Mrs. Dempsey," she said, "is Hargrove's office still standing?" "It's locked up. Bank put a padlock on it the morning after they found him." "A padlock?" "On the front door, which is their right, they say, since Ed had debts with the bank. Which is convenient." Ruth's eyes moved to Clara's face. "Why?" "Because I need to see his safe." The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. "That would require getting past a padlock," Ruth said, "and past whoever Aldgate has watching the building, because he does have someone watching it. And doing it in a way that doesn't get you thrown in a cell next to where they're keeping the Mendez boys, who made the mistake of showing up to their own land claim hearing with their deed in order." Clara put the letter back in her satchel. "I'll need to know the layout of the street, and I'll need to know when the watch changes." "You'll need more than that," Ruth said. "You'll need someone who knows this town well enough to move around in it without drawing attention." She looked at Clara for a long moment. "There's a man. He takes his meals here, pays his rent on time, doesn't talk much. He used to be a detective. He's been here 8 months trying to put together the same puzzle you're holding a piece of." "What's his name?" "Calloway. Wade Calloway." Ruth moved toward the door. He comes in for supper at 6. I'll introduce you. And Miss McCade, she paused in the doorway. Don't tell him about the key until you know whether you can trust him. In this town, that takes longer than one supper. Clara nodded. Understood. She spent the hour before supper, sitting on the edge of the bed, with Hargrove's file of letters spread across the blanket. He had written to her 7 times over 4 months. The first 5 were professional, detailed, discussing the terms of her employment, the scope of the work, what she would be paid. The 6th had a different quality, shorter, as if written quickly, mentioning that some of his current casework involved land transfer records, and that her experience with account reconciliation would be particularly valuable. The 7th was the one with the key. She laid them out in order and looked at the progression the way she looked at a set of books that had been altered, not at what was there, but at the shape of what was missing, the spaces where information should have been and wasn't. The careful way this 6th letter avoided naming what he was investigating. The urgency in the 7th that he had tried to keep out of the wording and hadn't quite managed. Ed Hargrove had known he was in danger. He had sent for her anyway. Not because he needed someone to keep his accounts, because he needed someone who could read a set of fraudulent records and put a legal name to what was wrong with them. Because whatever was in that safe required a specific kind of expertise to be useful, and a specific kind of person to be trusted with it. She folded the letters back into their envelopes. She was putting them away when she heard boots on the floorboards in the hall. A specific weight and rhythm. Someone moving toward the stairs. Then a knock at the door at the end of the hall, the other room. A door opening and closing. She listened to the sounds of someone moving around in the room next to hers and thought about what Ruth had said. 8 months. The same puzzle. At 6 o'clock, she went downstairs. Wade Calloway was already at the table. He was leaner than she expected, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in drought season, gray-green and watchful. He had the look of a man who had learned to make himself invisible in rooms, the kind of stillness that came from practice rather than temperament. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair, and there was a folded piece of paper on the table beside his plate that he turned face down when she walked in. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed. Ruth set a bowl of stew on the table and said, "Miss Clara McCade, just arrived from Cincinnati. Mr. Wade Calloway, currently between occupations." "Ma'am?" He nodded at the chair across from him. "Mr. Calloway?" She sat. She unfolded her napkin with the same deliberateness she used when opening a new set of books, setting the terms before the first number was entered. They ate in silence for 3 minutes. The stew was better than it had any right to be. Outside, the sound of horses on the main street, and someone playing a fiddle badly somewhere down the block. "You worked for Hargrove," Calloway said. It was not a question. "I was hired to work for Hargrove," she said. "He died before I arrived." 6 days ago. That's what they tell me. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. "Fell off his horse," he said. "That's what the official finding says." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not quite anything she had a name for. "How long were you on the train?" 3 days. "Must have been a hard ride, for that kind of news at the end of it." "I've had worse news," she said. "And I've had worse rides." He picked up his coffee cup. "What are you going to do?" "I have not decided." Which was true in the sense that she had decided, but was not prepared to share the decision with a man she had known for 6 minutes. "What are you going to do, Mr. Calloway? You've been here 8 months, working on something that has a habit of killing the people who get too close to it." The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at her over the rim of it. Ruth talks. Ruth is careful about what she says and who she says it to. which suggests that if she told me about you, she has a reason. Clara set down her spoon. You were a Pinkerton man. Was. Why did you leave? His jaw tightened, just slightly. That's a long answer for a first supper. Give me the short one. He set the cup down. They sent me to break a strike at a mill in Pennsylvania. Miners. Families. He was quiet for a moment. I quit instead. She studied him. She had spent 12 years studying the way people presented numbers that weren't accurate. And she had learned that the principle was the same, whether the currency was money or words. What he had just told her was true. It was also not everything. And he knew she knew it, and he was watching to see if she would push. She didn't. Not yet. Ed Hargrove was putting together a case, she said. Land fraud. Tax records that don't match the actual transfer dates. Payments routed through the bank that never appear in the county ledger. Calloway leaned back in his chair. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at evidence, cataloging, weighing, not showing his conclusions yet. How do you know that? He said. Because I know how to read a letter. And I know what questions a lawyer asks when he needs someone who can read account books and understand what's been altered. She held his gaze. He was building documentation, a paper case, something that could stand in front of a federal judge and hold up. He never made it to the judge. No. Whatever he had collected was locked in his office when he died. Yes. And the bank padlocked the office the next morning. Yes. Another silence. The fiddle outside had stopped. The street noise had quieted in the way small-town streets quieted after dark. Not empty, just cautious. Miss McCade, Calloway said slowly, is there something you're telling me or something you're asking me? Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Ruth had said. Don't tell him about the key until you know whether you can trust him. Both, she said. In that order. He leaned forward. His elbows came down on the table, and he looked at her directly for the first time since she had sat down, the watchfulness dropping just enough to show something underneath it. Not warmth exactly, but attention. Real attention. The kind that had a cost. I've been trying to piece this together for 8 months, he said. I know Aldgate is behind it. I know Baines works for him. I know there are at least 9 families who lost land they should not have lost. I have suspicions and patterns and nothing that would survive 1 hour in front of a judge. He paused. If Hargrove had documentation, real documentation, chain of title, payment records, anything with dates and signatures, that is the only thing in this county that could actually stop what Aldgate is doing. And if someone had access to that documentation, his eyes were very still. That would make them the most dangerous person in Red Rock right now. Yes, Clara said. I imagine it would. The lamp on the table between them threw uneven light across both their faces. Outside, a horse moved past at a slow walk. Somewhere in the building, Ruth was moving around in the kitchen, the sound of her work steady and unhurried. Calloway turned the folded piece of paper on the table over. He pushed it toward her without opening it. She looked at him. He nodded. She unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but precise, the kind made by someone who had looked at something long enough to memorize its shape. The main street of Red Rock, every building marked and named in small, careful handwriting. And in the middle of the block, circled twice, Hargrove's office, with a notation beside it, Watch, south window, changes at 10. She looked up. I've been trying to figure out what was in that safe for 6 weeks, he said. I don't have the combination, and I don't have any way to get it. Clara refolded the map and set it on the table between them. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and set the key beside it. Calloway looked at the key. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was not quite relief and not quite alarm, but was some particular mixture of both. Hargrove sent it to you? Before he died, yes. That key doesn't open the safe? No, she agreed. It opens a second drawer inside the safe. One that you wouldn't find unless you knew it was there. She tucked the key back into her pocket. Which means Ed Hargrove planned for exactly the situation we're in. He wanted someone to get into that office who had the key and knew what to look for. And he wanted that someone to be someone who could read what they found and understand why it mattered. Calloway was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered. He reached out and turned it down slightly, a reflex, reducing the light coming through the window. If you walk into that office, he said, and Aldgate finds out you have that key, you become a problem he needs to solve. The same way Hargrove became a problem. I know. I don't think you've been in this town long enough to know what that means. Mr. Calloway, Clara said, I have been in this town for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, I have been approached by men working for the bank, told that the official finding on Hargrove's death is a lie by a woman who has no reason to lie, and informed that the families being defrauded of their land are currently sitting in a jail cell while a corrupt sheriff looks the other way. She picked up her coffee. I grew up in Cincinnati. My father ran a dry goods business. When I was 17, the bank called in his loans using a clause that had been added to the contract after he signed it, in different ink, by a different hand. We lost the business, the house, everything. She set the cup down. I know exactly what this means. I've known it since I was 17 years old, standing in a courthouse, watching a judge rule in favor of a signed document that was not what my father signed. The silence between them was different now, less like distance and more like something being measured carefully. I'm sorry, Calloway said, and his voice was the flat, honest kind that did not add anything to the apology, did not soften it or explain it away, just said the words and meant them. Don't be, Clara said. It's what taught me to read a contract, and it's why Ed Hargrove sent for me. She stood. She smoothed down her skirt. She picked up her satchel. I'm going to bed, Mr. Calloway. I've been on a train for 3 days, and I would like to think clearly tomorrow morning. She looked at him. I'd appreciate it if we could speak again after breakfast. I'll be here, he said. She walked toward the stairs. At the bottom step, she stopped without turning around. Mr. Calloway, the man who approached me on the platform today, thick through the shoulders, a face like old leather. Who is he? A pause. Name's Greer. He runs errands for Aldgate. The kind of errands that don't get written down. Thank you. She went up the stairs. In her room, she closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment without lighting the lamp. She pressed the key between both palms, the cut metal cold against her skin. Outside the curtained window, the street was quiet. Far down the block, a door opened and closed. She crossed to the window and moved the curtain 1 inch. The man named Greer was standing at the corner of the street below, his back to the wall, his eyes on the yellow door of the boarding house. Clara let the curtain fall back. She sat down on the bed and opened her satchel and took out her account ledger. She wrote the date at the top of a clean page, then the name she knew so far, then the things she knew about each name, then the things she did not know and needed to find out. She wrote in her small, precise hand, the same hand she used for audit work, nothing that someone finding the book could act on without already knowing the context. When she was done, she stared at the page for a long time. Ed Hargrove had known something big enough to die for. He had trusted her with the key to it. And somewhere, in a locked office on the main street of Red Rock, behind a padlock, and a man named Greer, and the considerable weight of Jerome Aldgate's money and influence, was a drawer inside a safe that held either the truth or its absence. She would know which one by tomorrow night. She closed the ledger, lay down on the narrow bed with her boots still on, and listened to the town settle into silence around her. She did not sleep for a long time. Clara was at the kitchen table with her ledger open and her coffee untouched when Calloway came down the next morning. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, then moved to the chair across from hers without being invited, and sat down the way a man sits when he has been thinking all night and has run out of places to put the thoughts. "You were up early," he said. "I didn't sleep much." "Neither did I." He reached across the table and turned her ledger so he could read it without asking, which told her something about him. She let him look. He studied the page for a long moment, his eyes moving across her notations with the focused stillness of someone who understood what he was reading. "You've already mapped the sequence." "The land transfers follow a pattern," she said. "Aldgate files a tax delinquency claim. The claim gets recorded at the county clerk's office, which means it goes through one of two people, either Dale Sims or his deputy, both of whom would know immediately if the claim was fraudulent. 3 weeks later, the land goes to auction. The bank buys it. 6 months after that, the bank sells it to the Atchison Railroad Land Office at a price that doesn't appear in any public record I can find." She turned the ledger back around. "That's the structure. What I don't have is the mechanism. How the tax records are being altered without the state auditor catching it." Calloway wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Because the state auditor's quarterly report goes through Aldgate's bank before it goes to Santa Fe." She looked at him. "The county treasurer has his operating account there," Calloway said. "Aldgate processes the official documents as a courtesy. Has for 12 years. Nobody thought anything of it because nobody was looking." Until Hargrove. Until Hargrove. He set the cup down. Ed figured out that the report was being held for 2 days every quarter, long enough to alter the delinquency column before the original went north. He paused. "He told me this 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks before he died." The kitchen was quiet. Ruth was somewhere in the back of the house, her movements audible through the wall. Outside, the town was beginning its morning. Boots on boardwalks, the distant complaint of a wagon wheel that needed grease. "He told you," Clara said slowly, "and then he died." "Yes." "And you didn't leave." Calloway looked at her. "No." She studied his face. There was something there he was not saying, something specific and personal, sitting underneath the professional explanation, and she filed it away the same way she filed a discrepancy in a column of numbers. Not discarded, just set aside, until she had enough context to understand what it meant. "All right," she said. "Then you know the shape of it. What you don't have is the original records, the unaltered versions." She tapped the ledger, "which is what's in Hargrove's safe." "If he got that far." "He got that far. The key proves it. He wouldn't have sent it if there was nothing behind it worth protecting." She closed the ledger. "I need to get into that office tonight." Calloway leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "Greer watches the south side of the building. There's a second man, I don't know his name, who comes around to the alley behind it twice, between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. The padlock on the front door is a sleighmaker, good quality, takes a specific key. I'm not going through the front door." He looked at her. "There's a window on the north face of the building," she said. "I saw it this morning when I walked the street. Ground level. The latch is the old style, lever type. If the wood has swollen in the heat, the way it does in buildings that age, the latch won't seat fully. You walked the street this morning. I bought flour at the general store and took the long way back. She met his eyes. I also confirmed that the county clerk's office opens at 8, and that Dale Sims takes his lunch at the Territorial Hotel every day at noon, which means his deputy is alone in the office from 12 to 1. The silence stretched between them for a full 5 seconds. "Miss McCade," Calloway said carefully, "what exactly are you planning to do at the county clerk's office?" "Ask to look at the tax delinquency records, which are public documents, which I have every legal right to examine." She folded her hands on top of the ledger. "I'm an accountant. I have a letter of employment from a licensed attorney, however deceased. If someone asks me what I'm doing, I tell the truth. I'm reviewing records relevant to my late employer's active cases." She paused. "What they won't know is that I've already memorized the altered figures from the state auditor's quarterly report, which Ruth had a copy of in a box of Ed's papers she kept when she heard they'd locked the office." Calloway stared at her. "Ruth have his papers?" "Ed brought a box to her the week before he died. Asked her to keep it somewhere safe. She didn't know what was in it." Clara allowed a small pause. "I do now." He pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She could see the tension across his shoulders, the particular quality of a man recalculating something he thought he understood. "You've been here one night," he said to the window. 14 hours, she said, "but I read quickly." He turned around. There was something different in his face now, not the watchful assessment from the night before. Something closer to unsettled. This is not a game Allgate plays gently. The men who've crossed him don't end up in court. They end up like Hargrove. "I know that." "Do you?" "Mr. Calloway," her voice was even, "my father was a careful man who did everything right and still lost everything to a fraudulent contract. Ed Hargrove was a careful man who spent months building a case and still ended up dead on the Cutter Road. I understand that being careful and being right does not protect you from men with money and power and no conscience." She stood up and smoothed her skirt. "What protects you is moving faster than they expect and knowing things they don't know you know. That's the only advantage I have. I intend to use it." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked the way it had the night before, when she'd asked why he'd left the Pinkertons, the same internal process of deciding how much to say. "My brother's name was Thomas," he said. "He was 19. He had a small piece of land in Kansas that a bank decided they wanted. They filed a fraudulent tax claim. He went to dispute it at the county courthouse, and they arrested him on a charge of trespassing that made no legal sense. He died in the jail, waiting for a hearing that was never going to happen." He looked at his hands. "I was in Chicago. I didn't know until 2 weeks after." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's why you left Pinkerton," Clara said. "That's why I can't leave Red Rock until this is finished." He looked up. "So when I tell you to be careful, I am not telling you because I think you don't know what you're doing. I'm telling you because I've already lost someone to the version of this that I didn't move fast enough on." Clara held his gaze. She understood the specific weight of what he had just told her, because she had carried her own version of it for 11 years. The knowledge that the system had failed someone she loved, and that she had not had the tools to stop it. The difference was that she had spent the intervening years acquiring the tools. "Then let's not waste any more time," she said. The county clerk's office smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular staleness of documents that had not been disturbed in a long time. The deputy, a young man named Abel, with red hair and a tendency to look everywhere except directly at the person he was speaking to, had accepted her credentials with the nervous compliance of someone who did not know the rules well enough to know when to refuse. Clara stood at the record shelf for 40 minutes. She moved slowly, methodically, the way she moved through any set of books, starting with the structure before she looked at the content. The organization of the filing system told her things before she opened a single folder. The delinquency claims were kept separately from the general tax records, which was not the standard practice. The folders were labeled in 2 different handwriting styles, some in the careful script of a professional clerk, others in something faster and harder to read. She pulled the folders from the past 2 years and set them on the table. The pattern was exactly what she expected. Every altered record corresponded to a date within the 2-day window when Aldgate's Bank processed the quarterly report. The original figures had been changed in the delinquency column using a different ink, darker, slightly thicker, the kind of difference that was invisible to someone who wasn't looking for it, but unmistakable to someone who was. She did not copy anything. She memorized it. Column by column, entry by entry, name by name. 9 families, 47 separate records. The exact discrepancy figures that proved the claims had been filed after the state report had already gone through, not before. She put the folders back exactly as she had found them. She thanked the deputy. She walked out into the noon sun. Calloway was across the street, leaning against the wall of the hardware store in the attitude of a man with nothing to do. He saw her come out. He did not move toward her, just adjusted his hat by the brim in a small, acknowledging motion, and looked away. She went back to the boarding house. She sat down at the table in her room and opened her ledger to a clean page and began to write. She wrote for 2 hours, the figures coming out of her memory in precise sequence, the kind of recall that her first employer in Cincinnati had called unsettling, and her second employer had called invaluable. When she was done, she had a complete reconstruction of 9 fraudulent tax filings with the exact discrepancies noted, the dates they had been altered, and the corresponding dates on Aldgate's bank processing records as listed in the state auditor's report. It was not enough. It was the shape of the fraud, not the proof of it. The proof was in Hargrove's safe, the original, unaltered documents that predated the changes, the kind of primary source material that could not be argued away in front of a federal judge. She needed the safe. At 5 o'clock, Calloway knocked on her door. She opened it, and he stepped inside and looked at the ledger on the table without touching it. "Deputy Briggs came to see me this afternoon," he said. "He knows you were at the clerk's office this morning. I wasn't hiding that I was there. Aldgate knows, too." She closed the ledger. "How long do we have before he does something about it? Briggs thinks he'll move to have you removed from town before the week is out. Vagrancy charge, disorderly conduct, something technical that gives Baines an excuse to escort you to the county line." Calloway's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "Briggs told me because he doesn't like it. He doesn't know how to stop it, but he doesn't like it. Can Briggs be useful? Maybe. He's scared. But he's not corrupt. There's a difference." "There is," Clara agreed. "A scared man who knows the difference between right and wrong is more useful than a brave man who doesn't." She went to the window and adjusted the curtain a fraction. Greer was in his usual position at the corner. "We go tonight. Tonight. If Aldgate moves at the end of the week, we need what's in that safe before then. And we need time to get it out of the county to someone who can act on it." She turned from the window. "Is there a federal marshal's office within reach?" "Messia, 2 days by horse." "Who do you trust there?" He thought about it. The thinking took long enough that she knew he was being careful about the answer. Not performing consideration, but actually having it. "There's a man named Garrett. We worked together before I left Pinkerton. He's straight. Write him a letter tonight. Everything we have so far. If something goes wrong at the office, the letter gets out regardless." Calloway looked at her. "You're thinking about contingencies." "I'm always thinking about contingencies." She moved to the washstand and poured water into the basin. "Come back at 9. Wear dark clothes, and don't bring anything you're not willing to leave behind." He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite the watchfulness from before, and not quite anything she had a clear name for yet. "Miss McCade, for what it's worth." He stopped, started again. Ed Hargrove was a good man and a careful one, and he trusted his judgment about people. He sent for you specifically, not just for someone who could read a ledger. I think he knew what he was doing. Clara looked at him steadily. "So do I," she said. "Good night, Mr. Calloway." He left. She heard his boots in the hall, the sound of his door opening and closing. She stood at the washstand and looked at her own reflection in the small mirror above it. The face that looked back at her composed and dry-eyed and giving nothing away, which was the face she had learned to wear a long time ago in a Cincinnati courthouse while a judge read a verdict that destroyed her family. She had walked out of that courthouse and gone directly to the office of the only accountant in the city who would hire a 17-year-old girl with no references and learned everything he would teach her. She had spent 12 years getting here, to this room, to this town, to this particular lock on this particular safe. She picked up her pen and went back to the ledger. At 9 o'clock, when she went downstairs, Ruth was waiting in the hall. The older woman pressed something into her hand without speaking. Clara looked down. A small folded pocket knife. Old, but clean. "Ed's," Ruth said. "He left it in the box by accident, I think. Or maybe not." She met Clara's eyes. "You bring it back when you're done." "I will," Clara said. Ruth nodded once and went back to the kitchen. Calloway was on the porch in the dark, his jacket dark, his hat pulled low. He fell into step beside her without a word. The street was quiet in the way of 10 o'clock in a small town, not empty, but settled. The last of the evening drinkers still inside the saloon at the far end. A lamp burning in the hotel lobby. A dog sleeping in the dust at the mouth of an alley. They moved along the back side of the buildings, away from the main street. Clara kept her steps even and quiet, her satchel strap across her shoulder, the key pressed in her right hand. Hargrove's office was dark. The padlock on the front door gleamed dully under the distant lamplight. They went around to the north side. The window latch gave on the second try, the old lever lifting just enough for Calloway to work the frame up without sound. He went through first, then reached back and took her satchel while she followed. Inside, the office smelled of old paper and something else underneath it. The faint sweetness of pipe tobacco that had soaked into the wood of the desk over years of use. And below that, something chemical and sharp that had not been there before. Calloway touched her arm. She stopped. He leaned close to her ear. "Someone's been in here recently," he said, barely above a breath. "That smell. Lamp oil. Not from a lamp." Clara understood what that meant. She moved to the desk, found the safe in the corner behind it, exactly where Hargrove's letter had described. She knelt down. The combination she had worked out from a sequence embedded in Hargrove's second letter, the kind of encoding a careful man used when he didn't know who might read his correspondence. 3 turns right to 41, 2 left to 17, 1 right to 9. The safe opened. Inside, she found the document tray, the outer compartment holding what appeared to be routine papers. She felt along the back of the tray until her fingers found the secondary panel and the small keyhole set flush with the metal. She put the key in. It turned. The drawer slid out. She lifted the oil lamp Calloway had brought, and held it low over the contents. 2 inches of documents, original tax records with county clerk seals, a ledger in Hargrove's handwriting with the discrepancies annotated in the margins, copies of bank drafts, and on top of everything, a single sealed envelope addressed in Hargrove's hand to the office of the United States Marshal, District of New Mexico. He had been ready to send it. He had died before he could. Clara took everything out and transferred it into her satchel. She closed the drawer, locked it, closed the safe, spun the dial. She stood up. That was when they heard the boots on the front boardwalk. Calloway's hand closed around her arm before she could move. Not hard, not pulling, just the pressure of a decision being made in the space between 1 second and the next. He pointed at the window. She shook her head. The boots had stopped at the front door. One man, maybe two, she could not tell from the sound alone. But the quality of the silence that followed was the silence of someone listening, not walking past. She pointed at the desk. He understood. They moved behind it, low, the satchel pressed against her chest with both arms. Calloway extinguished the oil lamp. The darkness came down complete and sudden, and she felt rather than saw him settle beside her, close enough that she could feel the controlled steadiness of his breathing, and used it to regulate her own. The padlock on the front door rattled, then stopped. Then footsteps moved around the building toward the south side, away from the north window they had come through. Clara counted the seconds in her head the way she counted figures in a column. Automatic. Grounding. At 22 seconds, the footsteps stopped again, this time at the south window, the one Greer normally watched from outside. A voice, low and close, through the glass. "I don't see nothing." A second voice, farther away. "Check the latch." The south window rattled. Clara did not move. Beside her, Calloway was absolutely still, in the way of someone who had practiced stillness as a professional skill, not suppressing movement, but eliminating it entirely. The window rattled again. The latch held. "It's tight," the first voice said. "Then it's nothing. Probably a cat." A pause. "Greer said he saw a light." "Greer sees things." The footsteps moved away. South, then around to the front, then fading down the boardwalk toward the main street. Clara counted another full minute before she let her breath out slowly. "Greer saw the lamp," Calloway said, barely sound at all. "I know. We need to go. I know that too." They went out the north window, the way they had come in. Calloway went first this time, and she handed him the satchel before she came through. And when her feet hit the ground, he was already moving, keeping close to the building wall, away from the lamplight of the street. She followed. They went 2 blocks north before cutting back east toward the boarding house, moving through the alley behind the livery stable, where the smell of horses and hay covered any sound they made. Ruth was awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp turned low and a cup of something that had gone cold. And when they came through the back door, she looked at the satchel on Clara's shoulder, and then at their faces, and said nothing for a long moment. "You got it," she said finally. "We got it." Clara set the satchel on the table. "Greer saw a light. He reported it. 2 men came to check." She sat down. Her legs had been steady the whole way back, and now that she was sitting, they wanted to shake, which she did not allow. "They didn't get in, but they know someone was there." "By morning, Aldgate will know," Calloway said. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Clara. "Which means we have until morning to decide what to do with what you're carrying." "We're not waiting until morning." Clara opened the satchel and lifted the documents out carefully and laid them on the table in the order she had found them. Hargrove's ledger on top, the original tax records beneath it, the bank drafts beneath those, the sealed envelope at the bottom. She looked at the envelope. The marshal's name and address were written in Hargrove's precise hand. The seal was intact. "He wrote this himself," she said, "before he died. He was going to send it, and something stopped him." She set it aside and opened the ledger. "Mr. Calloway, you said there's a man in Mesilla named Garrett, federal marshal." "Yes. How fast can someone get to Mesilla?" "Riding hard, 2 days. Is there anyone in this town who can ride hard and be trusted to get there?" Calloway and Ruth looked at each other. Something passed between them that Clara recognized as the look of two people who had been holding the same thought for a long time and were deciding whether to say it. "Deputy Briggs," Ruth said. "He's scared," Calloway said. "Scared men do brave things when someone gives them a clear enough reason," Ruth said. "He's been watching what Aldgate does to people for 2 years, and he hasn't left, and he hasn't joined in. That means something." Clara looked at the sealed envelope. "This letter is addressed to the marshal's office. Hargrove wrote it. It carries legal weight as a dying declaration from a licensed attorney. If Briggs rides to Mesilla and hands this to Garrett personally, that is not a scared deputy doing something dangerous. That is a law enforcement officer delivering official correspondence." She looked at Calloway. "Can you get to Briggs tonight?" "His room is above the hardware store. I can be there in 10 minutes. "Go." She was already reaching for her pen. "I'm going to write a cover letter to accompany Hargrove's. Everything I found in the county records, the figures, the dates, the discrepancies, signed by me as an accounting professional with my Cincinnati credentials noted. It corroborates Hargrove's documentation from an independent source." She opened her ledger. "By the time you get back, I'll have it ready." Calloway stood up. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it, then put it down again and looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen there before. Not the careful watchfulness, not the controlled calculation. Something more unguarded than that. Something that sat uncomfortably close to worry. "If Aldgate figures out what we took before Garrett gets here," he said, "he will not wait for a formal proceeding. He'll move against you directly." "I know. I want you to understand that I mean directly, Miss McCade, not legally, not through Baines with a vagrancy charge." His voice was quiet and precise. "Directly." She met his eyes. "I understand. Go get Briggs." He went. Ruth refilled her cold cup from the stove and set it beside Clara's elbow without being asked. And the small, deliberate kindness of the gesture was the kind of thing Clara had learned not to let herself feel too much in the middle of work that required a clear head. She pressed it down and started writing. The letter took 40 minutes. She wrote it the way she wrote audit reports. Structured, specific, each claim supported by the exact figure that proved it. Each figure tied to the date and document it came from. She wrote without stopping to reconsider, because reconsidering was for situations where she had time, and she did not have time. When she finished, she blotted it and read it through once. It was the most damaging single document she had ever produced in 12 years of account work. And she had produced several that had ended careers, and one that had ended a business partnership in a way that required the involvement of the Cincinnati police. This was different. This was the kind of document that ended a system. She signed it, noted her credentials, and sealed it with the wax Ruth produced from a kitchen drawer without being asked. Calloway came back at midnight. Briggs was with him. Cole Briggs was younger than she had expected, maybe 25, with the particular look of someone who had spent 2 years slowly understanding that the job he had taken was not the job he had thought he was taking. He was not in uniform. He had dressed quickly, shirt not fully tucked, hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a continuous, nervous motion that he seemed unaware of. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Clara. Then he looked at Calloway with the expression of a man who wanted to be told this was simpler than it appeared. "It's not simpler than it appears," Calloway said, which told Clara he had worked with anxious people before and understood that the kindest thing was not to minimize. Briggs sat down. He picked up the tax records and looked at them, then at Hargrove's ledger, then at the sealed envelope with the marshal's address. He set them down in a careful stack. He was quiet for a moment. "If I ride to Messia," he said, "Baines will know I'm gone by morning." "Yes," Clara said. "He'll tell Aldgate." "Yes." "And Aldgate will know why." He looked at the documents again. "How long before Garrett can get here with enough men to do something?" "4 days minimum," Calloway said, "if he moves immediately." "A lot can happen in 4 days." "Yes," Clara said again. She kept her voice level. She was not going to make the decision sound easier than it was, because it was not easy, and Briggs deserved to have that acknowledged. "Deputy Briggs, I am not going to tell you this is without risk. It is significant risk. What I will tell you is that those 9 families whose land was taken, the Mendez brothers, sitting in your jail right now on a charge that does not hold water legally, Ed Hargrove, dead on the Cutter Road. All of that ends if Garrett gets here with federal authority behind him. And none of it ends any other way. Aldgate controls the local court, the sheriff, the newspaper. The only thing he does not control is a federal marshal from outside the county." Briggs turned the hat in his hands. He looked at Ruth. Something in his face when he looked at her was the look of a person checking a compass bearing, making sure the direction he thought was north was actually north. Ruth said, "Your daddy was a straight man, Cole. He would have ridden." Briggs put his hat on his head. He reached across the table and picked up the sealed envelope and Hargrove's original letter and Clara's cover document. He held them against his chest. "I'll need provisions for the road," he said, "and I'll need my horse not to be seen leaving the stable, which means I go out the back of Hendry's lot, not the main street." "I'll walk with you," Calloway said. "Ruth, can you put together—" "Already doing it," Ruth said from the larder. Briggs looked at Clara. "If something happens before Garrett gets here," he said, "something to you or to Calloway, what do I tell him?" "Tell him the documentation is complete and signed," she said. "Tell him the evidence is sufficient for federal prosecution of Jerome Aldgate, Sheriff Baines, and the county clerk, Dale Sims, as a minimum. Tell him Ed Hargrove built this case, and it cost him his life, and the least a federal court can do is make sure it meant something." Briggs nodded. He put the documents inside his jacket. His hands were not entirely steady, but they were close enough. 20 minutes later, he was gone. Clara sat at the kitchen table after Calloway came back and listened to the silence of the house settle around her. Outside, Red Rock was quiet in the deep way of 2 in the morning. Not the quiet of safety, but the quiet of a town that had learned to keep its head down after dark. Calloway sat across from her. He poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot, cold and thick by now, and drank it anyway. "Now we wait," he said. "Now we work," she said. "Aldgate will know by morning that someone was in that office. He'll know by tomorrow afternoon that Briggs is gone. He'll start counting what we might have and whether it's enough to hurt him." She pulled the remaining copies of her notes toward her. "We need to use that time." "To do what?" "The 9 families who lost land. Where are they now?" Calloway looked at her. "Some left the territory. Some are renting from the people Aldgate sold to. Some are still here, trying to hold on to what's left. I need to talk to them." He set the cup down. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed, and the noticing produced a small internal shift that she catalogued and set aside for later examination. "If this goes to federal court," she said, keeping her voice professional, "the case is stronger with sworn affidavits from the families who were defrauded. Hargrove's documents proved the fraud existed. The families proved the human cost of it. A federal judge acts faster when there are names and faces attached to numbers. Aldgate will know you're talking to them. Aldgate already knows I'm a problem. Me talking to a few ranching families changes nothing about that. She met his eyes. What it does do is give those families a reason to believe this might actually come to something. They've been sitting with what was done to them for 2 years, with no recourse. Someone ought to tell them there's recourse now. Calloway was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them burned low. Outside, somewhere down the street, a shutter banged once in a night wind, and then was still. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Who?" "My brother." He said it simply, without sentimentality, the way he had said everything so far, as if the words were just the accurate version of the thing, and that was enough. Thomas had the same way of looking at a problem, like it was a fixed point, and everything else was variables that could be adjusted until they came out right. Clara looked at him. She thought of a 19-year-old boy in a Kansas jail cell, waiting for a hearing that was never going to come. And she thought of this man sitting across from her, having spent 8 months in a small town he had no other reason to stay in, eating supper at Ruth Dempsey's table, and carrying that weight around like an unpaid debt. "I'm sorry about Thomas," she said. "Don't be." The reflex answer, the same thing she had heard from Gideon Holloway in the script she had read once about another kind of loss in another kind of town. But then Calloway stopped and started again, and his voice this time was different. "Actually, yes. I'd rather you were sorry than not. People say don't be, and they mean don't make me feel it right now. But I'd rather—" He stopped again. "I know," Clara said. The quiet between them after that was different from the quiet before. Not the measuring silence of two people deciding how much to trust each other. Something that had moved past that into something without a clean professional name. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated." "Tomorrow has been complicated since I stepped off the train." Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He stood, picked up his hat, moved toward the hall. At the doorway, he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "Ed Hargrove was a good judge of character. He trusted you with the key when he could have trusted anyone." He looked at her steadily. "That means something. I think I'm starting to understand what." He went upstairs. Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with the lamp and the documents and the cold dregs of the coffee and the particular feeling of a problem that had moved from the theoretical to the irreversible. She had the evidence. She had sent the letter. She had set something in motion that could not be stopped now, even if she wanted to stop it. She did not want to stop it. What she wanted was 4 days and a federal marshal, and for Jerome Aldgate to sit in a courtroom and hear his own numbers read back to him by someone who understood exactly what they meant. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs in the dark, one hand on the wall, her satchel still over her shoulder, because she was not leaving it anywhere she was not. She did not sleep. At 6 a.m, she heard boots on the porch below her window, a heavy, deliberate tread that was not Calloway's, and when she looked through the curtain, she saw Sheriff Baines standing at Ruth's front door with 2 men behind him, and his hand was already raised to knock. Clara had the satchel over her shoulder and was at her door before Baines's knock landed. She stood in the hall and listened. One knock, heavy and deliberate, the kind that announced authority before the door opened. Below her she heard Ruth's footsteps, unhurried, and the sound of the bolt being drawn back. She went to Calloway's door and opened it without knocking. He was already awake, already dressed, standing at his own window with his hand at the curtain. He looked at her when she came in. She held up 2 fingers, then 3. 2 men she had seen, possibly a third she had not. He nodded. He picked up his jacket from the chair and shrugged into it. Downstairs, Ruth's voice carried up through the floorboards, perfectly even, the tone of a woman who had opened her door to unwelcome visitors before and had no intention of communicating that they were unwelcome. "Sheriff, this is early." "Mornin', Mrs. Dempsey. I need to speak to your boarders." "My boarders are sleeping, like sensible people at 6 in the morning." "I think they're awake." Baines's voice was the flat, careful voice of a man who had learned that restraint was more effective than volume. "I'd appreciate not having to make this difficult." Clara looked at Calloway. He looked back at her, and in the 3 seconds of that exchange, something was decided between them that neither had to put into words. She went to the door. He came with her. They came down the stairs together, not hurrying, not hesitating. Clara had her satchel on her shoulder and her ledger under her arm, and her face arranged in the expression she used for meetings with senior partners at firms that had not originally wanted to hire a woman and needed to be shown immediately that their reluctance was their problem, not hers. Baines was in the hall, hat in hand, his 2 men still on the porch behind Ruth. He was in his 50s, heavy through the middle, with a gray mustache that had once probably been impressive and now just looked tired. He looked at Clara, then at Calloway, then back at Clara. "Miss McCade," he said, "I am going to need you to come with me." "On what grounds?" she said. "There was a break-in at the late Mr. Hargrove's office last night. I need to ask you some questions." "I'd be happy to answer questions here." "I'd prefer the office." "I'm sure you would." She kept her voice pleasant. "However, as I'm not under arrest, I'm not required to accompany you anywhere. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask them." She looked at him steadily. "What would you like to know?" Baines's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to this particular variety of resistance, she could tell. The kind that was completely calm and completely immovable, and grounded entirely in the law he was supposed to represent. "What were you doing last night between 9 and midnight?" "I was here. Mrs. Dempsey can confirm that." "Mrs. Dempsey is your landlady. She's not exactly a disinterested party." "Neither are you," Calloway said from beside her. His voice was mild. "Seeing as the office that was allegedly broken into contains documents that are relevant to an ongoing fraud investigation that names your employer." Baines looked at him with the particular look of a man deciding how much of his contempt to show. "You got no standing here, Calloway. You're not a lawman in this county. I'm a private citizen observing a conversation." Calloway folded his arms. "Which I'm allowed to do. Jerome Aldgate wants those documents back." The words came out before Baines could stop them. Or maybe he didn't try to stop them. Maybe the threat was the point. He seemed to realize a half-second later what he'd said, because something shifted in his face. A brief recalculation. "Whatever was in that office is property of the estate, and the bank has legal custody." "The bank has custody of furniture and business files," Clara said. "It does not have custody of evidence in a criminal proceeding, which is what those documents are." She held his gaze. "And since you just named Mr. Aldgate as the party requesting their return, you've also just confirmed that he has a personal interest in the contents of a deceased attorney's safe. Which is interesting, given that he was not a client of Mr. Hargrove's." She paused. "Is there anything else you'd like to ask me, Sheriff?" The hall was very quiet. Behind Baines, on the porch, one of the 2 men shifted his weight. Ruth stood to the side with her arms folded and the expression of a woman watching something she had been waiting a long time to see. Baines put his hat back on. "Don't leave town," he said. "I have no intention of leaving town," Clara said. He went. The porch cleared. Ruth closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, and let out a long, slow breath. "That'll get back to Aldgate within the hour," she said. "Good," Clara said. "Let him think I'm not afraid of him." "Are you?" Ruth said. Clara considered the question seriously, the way Ruth had asked it seriously. "Yes," she said. "But fear is just information. It tells you what the stakes are. It doesn't tell you what to do about them." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen to make breakfast. Calloway touched Clara's elbow as she turned toward the stairs. "You said Aldgate's name in there, to Baines. You put it on record." "In front of Ruth, who was a witness," Clara said. "Yes." "He'll know that within the hour, too." "Then we have less than an hour to do what we need to do." She was already moving up the stairs. "Eat something. We're going to see the Mendez family." The Mendez brothers were in the jail, but their mother was not. Elena Mendez was 63 years old and had been in New Mexico Territory for 40 years, which was 30 years longer than Jerome Aldgate. And she received Clara and Calloway at the door of her sister's house on the south edge of town, with the particular composure of a woman who had already survived everything that could be done to her, and was waiting to see what came next. Her English was precise and deliberate, each word chosen carefully, the way a careful person handles borrowed tools. "Mr. Hargrove told me," she said, when Clara had explained who she was and what she had, "that if he could get the original tax records, we would have a case. He said this to me 3 weeks before he died." "He was right," Clara said. "I have those records." Elena Mendez looked at the documents Clara laid on the table between them. She looked for a long time, without touching them. Then she looked up at Clara, and her eyes were very steady and very old, and contained something that was not quite hope, because hope was too light a word for what happened when a person who had stopped expecting anything started to expect something again. "My sons have been in that jail for 11 days, she said. "I know." "On a charge that any honest judge would dismiss in 20 minutes. "Yes." "Is there an honest judge?" "There will be," Clara said. 4 days, maybe less. I need you to tell me, on paper, what happened when the tax claim was filed. The date you received notice, the amount claimed, whether you were given opportunity to dispute it. What happened at the auction?" She had her pen ready. "I will write it as you tell it, and you will sign it, and that sworn statement becomes part of the federal case file." Elena Mendez put her hands flat on the table. They were working hands, the knuckles enlarged, the skin dark from decades of sun. Hands that had built something, and had that something taken away, and had kept going anyway, because stopping was not an option. "I can write my own statement," she said, "in my own words. I have been writing my own words for 60 years. Clara put the pen down. "Of course," she said. "I'm sorry." Elena Mendez nodded once, accepting the apology without making anything of it, and reached for the pen herself. They spent 2 hours at Elena Mendez's table. 3 other families came before noon, word having traveled in the particular way it traveled in small communities, where everyone knew which houses were safe to go to and which weren't. A rancher named Bert Caulfield, who had lost 80 acres he had held for 15 years. A widow named Pia Serrano, whose husband had died 6 months after losing their land, which she did not say was connected, but which the timeline suggested, and which she let Clara understand without saying. A young man, maybe 20, named Eli Dawson, who had come to New Mexico with his father 2 years before, and whose father was the one who had gone to dispute the claim and been found on the Cutter Road the same way Hargrove had been found, which nobody had called anything other than an accident, because nobody in Red Rock with a badge was interested in looking harder. Clara wrote everything down. Not in her own words, in theirs. She read each statement back before they signed it, and she made the corrections they asked for without comment. Because the corrections mattered. Because the difference between what she thought someone meant and what they actually meant was the difference between a document that told the truth and one that only approximated it. Calloway sat in the corner of the room through all of it, and did not speak unless someone addressed him directly. And when they did, he answered simply and without performance. He was good at this, she noticed, at being present without dominating, at understanding that his role in this particular room on this particular morning was to be a steady background fact and not the center of anything. When the last person had signed and left, he brought her a cup of water without being asked and set it beside her hand, which had begun to cramp from 2 hours of writing, and did not comment on the cramp or the water or anything about the previous 2 hours, except to say quietly, 7 statements. 7, she said. That's 7 families' worth of what Aldgate did, in their own words. It's the human record, she said. The financial documents prove the mechanism. This proves the damage. She flexed her hand. A federal prosecutor needs both. He was quiet for a moment, watching her add the signed statements to the satchel, with the same careful ordering she had used for the documents from the safe. You know what you're doing, he said, not a question. I've been doing this for 12 years. No, he paused. I mean, you know how to do this in a way that's about more than the case. The way you let Elena Mendez write her own statement. The way you listened to Eli Dawson talk about his father without trying to move him along. He looked at his coffee cup. That's not accounting. That's something else. Clara sealed the satchel flap. My grandmother used to say that numbers are the bones of a thing. They hold it up and give it shape. But the meat on the bones is the people. She picked up the satchel and stood. You need both, or you don't have anything that lives. He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued and set aside twice now. The one without a clean, professional name. This time she looked back at it directly for a moment before she turned away, because it seemed dishonest to keep pretending she hadn't noticed it. They went back to the boarding house. It was past 1 o'clock. The main street had the slightly suspended quality of a town that knew something was happening, but didn't know yet which way it was going to break. Greer was on the corner again. He watched them walk past with a particular quality of attention that meant he had instructions about them specifically. Clara did not look at him. Calloway did briefly, the flat professional look of a man cataloging a fact, and then looked away. Inside, Ruth met them at the door. Her face was arranged carefully, which meant she had something to tell them that she had been holding until they were inside. Aldgate came himself, she said, an hour ago. He knocked. I told him my boarders were out. He left. She paused. He was very polite. He asked me to tell you, Miss McCade, that he would like to meet with you this afternoon, at his bank. He said he believes there may be a misunderstanding that could be cleared up to everyone's satisfaction. Clara set the satchel on the table. She and Calloway looked at each other. He wants to see what you have, Calloway said, or what you know, or both. He wants to make an offer, Clara said. He's done the calculation, and he's decided that paying me to go away is cheaper than fighting me. She thought about it for 3 seconds. I'm going to go. Clara, with you, she said. We're both going, and we're not bringing the documents. She looked at Ruth. Will you keep the satchel? Ruth took it from the table without hesitation. Where? Somewhere he can't find it if he sends Baines here while we're gone. Somewhere you can get to it quickly if you need to. Ruth nodded and took the satchel and went toward the back of the house. Clara trusted her to know where. Some things you did not need to supervise. Jerome Aldgate's bank was the largest building on the main street. Red brick, 2 stories, with the name lettered in gold above the door. His office was on the second floor, and it was the office of a man who had spent 20 years making sure every visible surface communicated that he was the most substantial person in the room. He was maybe 60, silver-haired, with the particular sleekness of a man who had never done physical labor and had arranged his life to ensure he never would have to. He stood when they entered. He gestured at 2 chairs with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that warmth was a tool. "Miss McCade, Mr. Calloway." He settled back into his own chair. "Thank you for coming. I'll be direct. I believe we may have gotten off on a poor footing, and I'd like to correct that if we can." "All right," Clara said. "Be direct." He looked at her with the faint recalibration of a man who had expected more preamble. "I understand you've been gathering documents relating to my bank's land acquisition activities. I also understand you've been speaking with certain parties who have grievances, legitimate grievances. I won't deny that there have been errors made in the process." "They're not errors," Clara said. "Errors are accidental. What's in those tax records is deliberate and sequential and has been occurring for 2 years. She held his gaze. "You know that. I know that. This conversation will go faster if we don't pretend otherwise." Aldgate was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. A recalculation, a shift in the estimation he had formed of her before she sat down. "What is it you want?" he said. "I want the Mendez brothers released from jail today, on the grounds that the charge against them has no legal basis. I want the land claims against all 9 families reviewed by an independent assessor, and the fraudulent claims vacated. I want the original documents showing the tax discrepancies submitted to the county court, along with a full accounting of the proceeds from the land sales." She folded her hands in her lap. "And I want it done before the federal marshal arrives, so that when he gets here, there is a record showing that this county attempted to correct its own wrong, which will be taken into account in sentencing." The room was very still. Calloway had not moved beside her. He was doing the thing he did, being a steady background fact, and she was grateful for it, in a way she would have found difficult to articulate in professional terms. Aldgate looked at her for a long moment. The warmth had left his face entirely. What was underneath it was colder and more precise, the actual intelligence of the man who had built a system sophisticated enough to deceive a county for 2 years. "You're very confident," he said, "for a woman who's been in this town 3 days. "I'm confident in the documents," she said. "The documents don't care how long I've been here. Documents can be disputed, questioned, lost." He said it evenly, without heat, which was the most threatening way it could be said. "These particular documents are no longer only in one place," Clara said. "They were last night. They aren't now." She met his eyes. "That's all I'm going to tell you about that." Another silence. Longer this time. "Get out of my office," Aldgate said. The warmth was entirely gone, and what was left was the cold, flat voice of a man who had stopped calculating outcomes and started planning responses. "Both of you. Now." They went. They walked down the stairs and out through the bank's front door and onto the main street in the afternoon heat, and Clara kept her pace steady and her chin level and did not let anything show until they had turned the corner and were half a block away. Then her hands started shaking. She pressed them against her skirt, the way she had learned to do a long time ago, the pressure stopping the visible tremor before it communicated itself to anyone watching. Calloway saw it anyway. He fell into step, close enough that if she needed something to steady against, it was there, without making anything of the fact that it was there. "He's going to move tonight," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were almost steady. "He's not going to take the offer. He's going to try to end this before Garrett arrives. I know. We need to be somewhere he can't reach us easily. Somewhere public enough that whatever he does, people see it." "The hotel dining room is open until 9, Calloway said. Ruth knows most of the families there, and Tatum, the blacksmith, he's been watching Aldgate for a year and a half. He's the kind of man who shows up when something is happening, and it matters which way it goes. Clara nodded. She was thinking. She was thinking about 4 days, and whether Briggs had made good time, and whether Garrett was the kind of man who moved fast when he received a dead lawyer's sealed letter, and whether the 9 families sitting in that hotel dining room tonight would be enough of a public fact to make Aldgate hesitate for the days they needed. She was also thinking about Calloway's arm brushing hers as they walked, the specific warmth of it, not incidental, but not declared, the thing she kept cataloging and setting aside. Wade, she said, the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her. If this goes wrong tonight, it won't. If it does, she said, I need you to know that you have been the most useful person I have encountered in 12 years of account work. And I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was fully the thing she had been cataloging, not adjacent to it anymore, not contained in professional distance. That's a hell of a thing to say to a man, he said quietly, on a day when everything might go sideways. I know, she said. I said it anyway. They walked the rest of the way to the boarding house without speaking, and the silence between them was the kind that had changed shape entirely from the silence of the first supper 2 nights and a lifetime ago. Ruth had supper on the table by 6. She had not been asked to make enough for 12 people, but she had made enough for 12 people, which told Clara that Ruth had been running her own calculations all afternoon and had arrived at the same conclusion without being told. The families came quietly, 1s and 2s, through the back entrance off the alley that Ruth left unlatched. Elena Mendez came with her daughter. Bert Caulfield came with his wife, a small woman named Ada, who said nothing and watched everything. Eli Dawson came alone and sat at the end of the table with the particular stillness of a young man trying to hold himself together in a room full of adults who were also trying to hold themselves together. Pia Serrano came and sat beside Elena Mendez, and the 2 women held each other's hands on top of the table without comment. The blacksmith Tatum came last, filling the doorway briefly before he folded himself into a chair near the wall, his big hands around a coffee cup, his eyes moving across the room in a slow professional sweep. Calloway stood near the back. Clara sat at the center of the table, with her ledger open and the satchel on the floor beside her chair. Ruth, having retrieved it from wherever she had put it with the same wordless efficiency she applied to everything. I'm going to tell you where things stand, Clara said. All of it. No softer version. She told them. She told them about the documents from the safe, about the 7 sworn statements now part of the federal case file, about Briggs writing to Messia with Hargrove's sealed letter and her own cover document. She told them about the meeting with Aldgate that afternoon, what she had asked for, what he had said when she refused to be bought. She told them that a federal marshal was 4 days out at minimum, and that Aldgate knew something was coming, and that the next 4 days were the dangerous ones. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked her to slow down or repeat anything. They listened the way people listened when they had been waiting a long time for someone to say the true version of the thing they already knew. When she finished, Bert Caulfield set his coffee cup down and said, "What do you need from us?" "I need you here," she said. "Visible. In this house, in this room. If Aldgate moves against me or Mr. Calloway tonight, I need witnesses, not fighters. Witnesses. People who can stand in front of a federal judge and say what they saw." "And if he decides witnesses aren't a problem," Tatum said from his corner, his voice the slow, deliberate voice of a man who had thought about this question before asking it. "Then we have a different situation. Calloway said from the back. Which is why I'm going to be outside rather than in, watching the street. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. The conversation they had on the walk home from the bank was still in the air between them. Not resolved, just present. The way something was present when it had been said honestly, and then set aside because there were more pressing facts to manage. "You're not going outside alone," Tatum said. "I'm not asking for company." "You're not being asked." Tatum set his cup down and stood up. His head nearly reached the ceiling. "I know 3 other men on this street who have been watching what Aldgate does for long enough that they'll stand a porch watch for one night without needing a speech about it. Give me 20 minutes. Calloway looked at him. Something passed between them that was the look of one man accurately assessing another and finding the assessment satisfactory. 20 minutes, he said. Tatum went out the back. The room settled into the particular quality of a group of people who had committed to something and were now waiting for the thing they had committed to arrive. Clara opened her ledger. She had one more thing to do before the night took over whatever shape it was going to take. She wrote a second letter to Marshal Garrett, shorter than the first, documenting the afternoon meeting with Aldgate, his implicit threat about documents being lost, and the current situation at the boarding house. She noted the date and the time, and signed it. She folded it and addressed it, and gave it to Ruth without explanation. Ruth took it and went to the back room, and came back a minute later without it, which meant she had a method for getting correspondence out of the house that Clara did not need to know the details of, and was glad Ruth had thought of on her own. By 8 o'clock, Tatum was back. He said nothing about who he had spoken to or what arrangements had been made. He simply resumed his chair and his coffee cup and his slow, watchful survey of the room. And sometime around 8:30, Clara became aware through the quality of the sounds outside that there were men on the street in positions that had not been occupied an hour ago. The creak of a chair on a porch across the way. The particular silence of someone standing still in a doorway. The town was watching. At 9:15, Baines came. He came with 4 men, not 2, and he came to the front door this time, not the porch. His knock was louder than the one at 6 in the morning, the knock of a man who had been given different instructions since the last visit. Ruth answered it. Clara was already standing. "I need Miss McCade to come with me," Baines said. "She's being detained for questioning in connection with the theft of property from the estate of Edward Hargrove." "On whose authority?" Clara said from the hall behind Ruth. "The authority of this county's sheriff's office, which operates at the direction of Jerome Aldgate," Calloway said. He had come in from the back when she hadn't been watching, and he was standing at the far end of the hall with his jacket on and his hat in his hand, and the particular stillness that meant he had been in this kind of room before and knew what the options were. "That's a slanderous allegation," Baines said. "It's what you told me yourself this morning," Clara said, "in front of Mrs. Dempsey, who is a witness. You said, and I'm quoting you accurately, that Jerome Aldgate wants those documents back." She took 2 steps forward toward the door. "That is not the language of a law enforcement officer acting in the public interest. That is the language of an employee acting on instruction." She stopped. "I will not be going with you, Sheriff." Baines pushed the door open the rest of the way. He stepped inside. Behind him, his 4 men filled the porch and the 2 steps leading up to it. Behind Clara, the sound of chairs moving back from the table as the families stood. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, ma'am." "It doesn't need to be hard at all." Clara held her ground. She was aware of her heart rate, and aware that awareness was useful information, and aware that she had been in rooms where someone with power was trying to use it against her before, and that the only tool she had ever had in those rooms was clarity. "If you take me out of this house tonight, there are 11 witnesses in this building who will swear to what they saw. There are men on this street right now who will see me leave. And there is a letter already written and already sent that will reach a federal marshal within 2 days, documenting this moment along with every other moment of the past 3 days. She met Baines's eyes. Jerome Aldgate has made a calculation that removing me removes the problem. He is wrong. The problem is in the documents, and the documents are no longer in one place, and taking me out of this house will not change that. It will only add to the federal case against him. She paused. Go back and tell him that. The hall was very quiet. Baines stood in the doorway, with 4 men behind him and 11 people behind her, and the full weight of Jerome Aldgate's instruction on one side, and the full weight of everything Clara had built over 3 days on the other. And she watched him feel that weight and understand what it meant. He looked past her at the room full of faces. Elena Mendez, her hands folded, her eyes steady. Bert Caulfield, standing with his wife's hand in his. Eli Dawson, no longer looking like a young man trying to hold himself together, looking instead like a young man who had decided. Tatum, not having moved from his chair, not needing to move, his presence in the room its own kind of argument. Baines put his hat back on. Don't leave town, he said, for the second time that day. I've told you already, Clara said. I have no intention of leaving. He went. The porch cleared. Ruth closed the door, and this time she put the bolt across it, and turned and looked at Clara with an expression that was not quite a smile, and was something better. The room exhaled. Eli Dawson sat down first, heavily, as if his legs had decided the crisis was over before the rest of him had. Pia Serrano pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Elena Mendez said something in Spanish to her daughter, that Clara did not speak but understood by tone, to be the kind of thing a mother says when something she has been praying for has begun to be possible. Calloway crossed the hall to where Clara was standing. He stopped in front of her. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with the full version of the things she had been cataloging and setting aside for 3 days. Not behind the watchfulness now, not adjacent to anything else, just present and clear and entirely unambiguous. You know, he said quietly, when Ruth told me she had a boarder coming who used to work for Hargrove, I thought it was going to be a clerk. Someone with a box of letters and a lot of questions. I do have a lot of questions, Clara said. Not the same kind. He looked at her hands, which were no longer shaking, which had stopped shaking somewhere in the middle of looking Baines in the eye, and were now simply her hands. You know what you did just now. I told him the truth in a way he couldn't argue with. You held a line, he said, in front of every person in this room, in front of Baines and whoever's standing at the corner reporting back to Aldgate. He was very close now, the distance between them having reduced itself at some point in the last 30 seconds, without either of them managing it deliberately. I have not seen anyone hold a line like that since... He stopped. Since Thomas, he said. Thomas would have done it exactly like that. Quiet and absolute, and so grounded in the truth of the thing that there was no room for anything else. Clara looked at him. The lamp behind them threw their shadows long across the floor. The noise of the room continued around them, the families talking, Ruth moving toward the kitchen, Tatum accepting a second cup of coffee from Ada Caulfield, the sounds of people who were still afraid but had remembered that they were not alone. Wade, she said. Yes. When this is over, when Garrett gets here and the case is in federal hands and those families have their land back. She held his eyes. I don't know what I do after that. I don't have a plan past getting Aldgate in front of a judge. I had a job, and the man who hired me is dead, and I've been moving so fast I haven't stopped to think about what comes next. I know, he said. I'm telling you because... She stopped, started again. Because you asked me once, the first night at supper, what I was going to do. And I said I hadn't decided. And now I'm telling you that the part I haven't decided is the part that comes after. Not the case, not the work. The after. He was quiet for a moment. His hand came up slowly, deliberate and unhurried, and he turned the brim of his hat over in his fingers, the way he did when he was working through something he wanted to say accurately. "I've been in this town 8 months," he said, "telling myself I'd leave when the case was finished. Go back east, maybe. Find different work. Something quieter." His eyes stayed on hers. "I've been telling myself that less convincingly than I was 8 months ago." "Why?" "Because this town has gotten under my skin in a way I didn't expect." He paused. "And because some of what's gotten under my skin arrived 3 days ago on a train from Cincinnati with a key in her boot and a ledger under her arm, and no patience whatsoever for being told the situation was complicated." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had said once that a person could spend a whole life being practical and sensible and correct, and that was a worthy life. But that a person who could also be brave about the things that were not practical and not sensible and not easily made correct, that was a different kind of life entirely. "I've been practical for 12 years, she said. "I noticed. I think I'd like to try something different." The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it was entirely a smile, unhurried and real, and reaching all the way to his eyes. The first full one she had seen from him in 3 days of watching his face carefully. "That," he said, "sounds like a reasonable next step." Garrett arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day. He came with 4 deputy marshals and a federal writ that he had, according to what he told Calloway afterward, written himself on the road, using a flat rock as a desk and a lantern held by one of his deputies, because he had read Hargrove's letter and Clara's cover document and had not slept for 36 hours and had not wanted to. Jerome Aldgate was arrested at his bank at 4 in the afternoon. Sheriff Baines was arrested at the jail, which had a certain symmetry to it that Tatum noted aloud at supper that night, to the general agreement of everyone at the table. Dale Sims, the county clerk, surrendered himself to Garrett's office before sundown, which Garrett said later was the fastest surrender he had seen in 20 years of federal work, and which suggested Sims had known this day was coming for some time. The Mendez brothers walked out of the jail an hour after Aldgate went in. Miguel Mendez, the older one, came directly to the boarding house and stood at the door with his hat in his hands and looked at Clara for a long moment and said, "My mother says you are the one." He seemed to feel this was sufficient, and Clara supposed it was. The land claims took longer. Federal proceedings always did. But Garrett was methodical, and the documentation was complete, and there was not a single figure in Clara's reconstruction that did not match the original records from Hargrove's safe. Because she had been right about what Ed Hargrove had built, and what he had trusted her to find, and what the key meant that he had sent her with his last careful letter. On the 5th day after Garrett's arrival, when the immediate machinery of the federal case had been set into motion, and the county was beginning the long process of understanding that its structure of power had changed, Clara sat on the front step of Ruth's boarding house in the early morning before the heat built, her ledger open on her knees, the new page empty. She was writing a letter to a firm in Santa Fe that had written to Hargrove 3 months before his death, inquiring about his professional contacts in the area of financial fraud investigation. She had found the letter in the box of his papers Ruth had kept. She was telling them that Mr. Hargrove was no longer available, but that she was, and that she had recent and substantial experience in the particular kind of work they were inquiring about, and that she could provide references from Cincinnati, and also from a federal marshal in Mesilla, if that would be useful. She was on the 2nd paragraph when she heard the door open behind her, and felt the particular weight of Calloway settling onto the step beside her, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, which she had stopped cataloging as something to set aside, and had simply accepted as information about the current situation. He held out a cup of coffee. She took it without stopping writing. "What are you writing?" he said. "A letter." "To who?" "A law firm in Santa Fe. They need someone who does financial fraud work." She finished the sentence she was on. "It would mean staying in the territory." He was quiet for a moment. "Would it?" "Possibly, if they're interested." She dipped her pen. "There's also the question of what happens to Hargrove's practice. Garrett says the estate is likely to be resolved in a way that leaves the office and its files available. Someone with appropriate credentials could petition to take over active cases." She glanced at him. "There are 9 families who need legal and financial representation to reclaim their land through the federal process. That work could take a year or more." "Could it?" Calloway said. His voice had the quality it had when he was fully attending to something and trying not to show how fully he was attending to it. "It could." She capped her pen. "I'm not saying I've decided. I'm saying it's a reasonable option." "It is," he said. "It's a very reasonable option." He looked at the street in front of them, at Red Rock, waking up on a morning that was different from every morning that had preceded it. People moving with a slightly altered quality, a loosening, the particular way people moved when something that had been pressing down on them for a long time was lifted. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I said, about going back east when the case was finished. And I think I was wrong about what 'finished' means." He turned to look at her. "Aldgate's in custody. The federal case is in Garrett's hands. By any reasonable measure, the case I came here to work is done." He paused. "But there are 9 families that need the rest of the work done. And there's a town that needs people in it who know how the machinery of fraud works and how to dismantle it when it shows up again, because it always shows up again somewhere." His voice was steady and direct, in the way it always was when he had thought something through to its honest conclusion. "I think staying is the right thing to do." "Because of the work," Clara said. "Because of the work," he agreed. And then, without looking away from her, "And because of other reasons." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning sun was just beginning to come over the eastern hills, and it caught the side of his face and the gray threading through his dark hair, and the eyes that were no longer the closed, watchful creek-water color of the first supper, but something warmer and more open, something that had made a decision and was not negotiating with the decision anymore. "Wade," she said. "Yes?" "I'm not an easy person to work alongside." "I noticed that in the first 10 minutes. I have opinions about everything, and I'm usually right, and I don't soften things when I should." "Also noticed." "And I spent 12 years building a wall out of numbers and practicality, and it's going to take me some time to stop reaching for it as a first response." "Clara." His voice was very quiet. "I spent 8 months in a town where nobody told the truth about anything. I've been waiting 3 days for someone to say something honest about the thing that is sitting between us on this step. And I appreciate that you're doing it now. But I want you to know that none of those things you just listed are problems. They are the exact facts about you that made me decide within approximately 48 hours of meeting you that I did not want to be in any town you were not in." The step was very quiet. The street was waking up around them, horses and boots, and the distant clang of Tatum's forge already starting for the day. The sounds of a place continuing on. "That's a very direct thing to say," Clara said. "You said you wanted direct." "I did." "Then?" He reached out and took the hand that was not holding the coffee cup, and held it the way he had put his arm near hers on the walk from the bank. Deliberate and unhurried and present, not asking for anything back yet, but making himself entirely clear. "Is that all right?" She looked at their hands. His were the hands of a man who had done hard work and difficult work, and the kind of work that left marks that didn't show on the surface. Hers had ink on the second finger of the right hand, which was a permanent condition she had long since stopped apologizing for. "Yes," she said, "that's all right." They sat on the step of Ruth Dempsey's boarding house in the early morning of a day that was the first uncomplicated day Red Rock had seen in 2 years, drinking cold coffee in the growing light, her hand in his, the ledger still open on her knees, to the letter she had not finished writing, and the town coming alive around them with the particular sound of ordinary life resuming its ordinary shape after something extraordinary had moved through it. Ruth opened the door behind them at some point, assessed the situation on the step, and went back inside without saying anything, which was the highest form of approval she was capable of, and which both of them understood perfectly. Clara finished her letter that afternoon. She posted it herself, walking to the mail office with her ledger under her arm and Calloway one step behind her, and she handed it across the counter and watched it disappear into the stack of outgoing correspondence, and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had come a long way with a key in her boot and nothing guaranteed, and had found on the other side of a great deal of hard and dangerous work something worth staying for. Ed Hargrove had sent for her because he needed someone who could read the truth inside a column of numbers and make it stand up in the light where everyone could see it. She had done that. She had also, without entirely planning to, built a life in the space where the work had been, the way a person sometimes builds a life, not by deciding to, but by doing the next necessary thing, and the next, and the next, until one morning they look up and find they are exactly where they were supposed to be. Clara McCade had come to Red Rock with a key and a ledger, and nowhere left to go. She left the mail office on a Wednesday morning in the New Mexico sun, with a man beside her who told the truth, and a town that was beginning to remember what honesty felt like, and work that mattered and would keep mattering for years to come. And she did not look back at the door closing behind her, because she was already looking forward. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.